Want to give a quick shout out to all of my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Hey everybody, so we are about a quarter of the way through the year, and I thought it would be a good time for me to give you a breakdown of my top 10 favorite fantasy books that I've read thus far in 2023, starting with number 10. And number 10 is Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill. This is the first book in the Bound and the Broken series, and yeah, I really like this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5, but I gave it a 4 out of 5 because it just doesn't do anything super new, but it does feel like that old school kind of fantasy. A book that felt like it would have come from like the 80s or early 90s, but it does it in a little bit more fresh way. And I get there's been, thousands and thousands of fantasy books, and so of course you're gonna have to borrow things here and there, but it just didn't do anything terribly unique, but it was fun. I like the story, and I'm really encouraged because quite literally everybody tells me that this one is the weakest in the series. And if the weakest in the series is a 4 out of 5, that spells very good things about things going forward. So yeah, very excited to power through this series throughout the rest of 2023. Number 9 is Winter Solstice. This is the 4th book in the Wandering Inn series by Pyra Abba. And I'm obsessed with this series. I also gave this book a 4 out of 5, which is the lowest score that I have given a Wandering Inn book. But it's just fun. I mean, Wandering Inn is just such a fun series. This is a lit RPG, but it's like the best of the lit RPGs, so don't let that dissuade you from wanting to get into this book. But it just feels like, some older kids or like young adults got trapped into a Dungeons and Dragons type of world, straight up with leveling and getting classes and stuff. It's just non-stop fun, and it's written in this format because it's a web serial that every chapter feels like its own isolated story. So you're never going to read a chapter of this book and feel like let down because nothing happened. Something happens every single chapter, and it keeps things really exciting and fresh, and I can't wait to keep reading. I'm never going to catch up because the writer writes faster for the web version than the books are released, because this author writes unprecedentedly fast. But I don't have to be caught up. I'll enjoy things as they come. I think there's going to be 2 books that come out a year, so that's plenty for me, and I'm loving the series. Number 8 is The Bone Ship's Wake. This is the 3rd book in the Tide Child trilogy, so the final book. This is by R.J. Barker, and I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. I love so much about the Tide Child. It's this awesome seafaring tale, and I love ships in my books. I'm just obsessed with them. And this is like the best of the bunch. It's such a fun story about like sea dragons and a unique twist on this factionalized government and how you end up seeing this amazing captain and teaming up with this totally loser other like former captain, all from that kind of loser's perspective. It's got a fresh magic system, very interesting characters, great dialogue, wonderful read from start to finish. Everyone needs to check out this trilogy. Number 7 is a book that I feel like everyone's heard about, and this is Tress of the Emerald Sea. This was the first book from Brandon Sanderson's Secret Projects, and I was so shocked at how good this one was. I've gotten a little bit soured on some Brandon Sanderson stuff lately, especially the Mistborn Era 2. Not a fan. And that last book I absolutely hated. So I went into this thinking like, oh, I'm going to get more of the same. But no. This was such an exciting, fun tale with great twists, great characters, super interesting magic. It felt like Brandon Sanderson is like back for me. Now most people say like, well, he never went away. But for me, it's like just reminding me about how stunning this author is to write this. It almost had like this Princess Bride feel to it, which is awesome. There had some humor into it. Some of it didn't hit, some of it did. But just such a great story that I cannot wait to read again when my kids get a little bit older, and I'd love to read along with them to go through this fun, kind of family-friendly tale. Very excited about the rest of the Secret Projects as well, and I can't wait because that Secret Project number 2 is going to be my first read next month. Number 6 is Magician Apprentice. This is the first book in the Rift War saga by Raymond E. Feist. It's not really the first book because apparently the books have been split into 2, so the first book is actually half of the first story, so I didn't really realize that, but man, it's good. This is an 80s book. I feel like it was written in like 1982, and I have been soured on some older, like early 80s kind of fantasy books, and I thought maybe they're just not for me. Well, that's not true, because man, this blows it out of the park. This is I know it seems like a crazy statement, but this feels like it took what Lord of the Rings did and just went in a better direction. And I like Lord of the Rings, not as much as most of you probably, but it's just great. Every single thing about this book is great. The magic is fun, just a super fun story. I keep saying that in these, but fun books are what I like to read. And that's very much what this was. Awesome like dragon sequences and dwarves and elves and all the things that you would want out of an old school fantasy. It's here, but written extremely well and complicated in a huge world. Awesome book. Number 5 is 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. This is by K.J. Parker, and this is the first book in the Siege series. And while it's a series, you can really read this one as a standalone. And I've never read anything like it before. I love siege warfare. I've always been interested in that aspect. And it's such a good story about this engineer who suddenly finds himself in charge of the defense of the city under siege. And he doesn't run things like a politician. He runs things like an engineer would. It's so fun to think from that perspective. Somebody that just kind of logically thinks about things is able to like section parts of their brain off to try to, analyze a problem, solve the problem. It's a super fresh book. And you'll know right away if it's for you or not, because the writing style is very unique. Kind of like just the tone of it. Read just a few pages of it. Maybe like on Amazon, you can usually read the first few pages. Check out the first few pages. If you like it, you're gonna love it, but you might not. Number 4 is The Wise Man's Fear. This is the second book in the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the reread for me. I read this book 8 years ago, and I gave it an increased score. I gave it a perfect 5 out of 5, when previously I gave it a 4 out of 5. I don't know what changed for me, but I liked it so much more than the first time I read it. I think I appreciated the prose a lot more because I had read so few fantasy books when I first read it that I didn't realize that this isn't kind of like the standard. This isn't the average kind of fantasy book. This is something really special. And it did have like a weird part in it with like this sex fairy weird sequence, but it wasn't as long as I remembered it. It was like 50, 60 pages, which is like nothing. You get through that in like one sitting. And then you're right back to the action. So a wonderful story. I will always forever recommend the Kingkiller Chronicle to people, even if that third book never comes out. Number 3 is The 11th Cycle. This is the first book in the Mistland series. This is a brand new book in 2023. This is by 𝐂𝐪𝐿, and this has kind of been touted as a Dark Souls kind of book. And that's true, but you don't really understand that until like the halfway point. It feels very standard fantasy fare for a while. But man, this 𝐂𝐪𝐿 can write his butt off. He's so talented. The character writing is magnificent. Just so well done. And this is dark. I love grimdark. This puts a lot of grimdark to shame with not just how good it is, but how dark it is. I mean, there were the darkest of the darkest moments that I've ever read in fantasy, and I love that in a fantasy book because I like to read things different. I like to see these bottom of the bottoms be hit so that the top of the tops, when they get there, feel so much more earned, and I appreciate them more. And this certainly had that. And what a great ending to the story, and it makes me so excited to finish out and read the next book in this series. I think it's going to be a 4-book series, but hopefully more, because the more the merrier on this. Number 2 is the last book that I read, and that is Empire of Silence. This is part of the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio, and oh man, this is one of my all-time favorite books. And I'm so happy that I can say that so early on in 2023, but I don't really like sci-fi. But maybe I do, because oh baby, is this good. But apparently this is like sci-fantasy is the term for it, because it reads like a fantasy book, even though it's set in this outer space kind of realm. Incredible, not just an incredible story, but more than that, the writing is right up there with like Patrick Rothfuss for how good the prose is. It just gets you so enraptured in this story. I can't wait to read more and see where this is going. And in another one, kind of like what I had mentioned earlier with Of Blood and Fire, but everybody says this is the worst of the bunch. And if the worst one of the bunch is one of my favorite all-time books, I am in for a treat going forward. Which leads us to number 1. And number 1 is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is the first book in the Dandelion Dynasty. And this is what I will say is my second favorite book that I've ever read. The first being the last book in Malazan Book of the Fallen. But I can't get enough of this book. This is a historical retelling, but in a fantasy way, of the Han Dynasty from, I don't know how long ago, like 1,000 years ago, maybe more, in Chinese history. And it's just wild. It's crazy how much action is packed into the book that it is. It's not a small book, but there's more action that goes into this than like all of A Song of Ice and Fire. And I love A Song of Ice and Fire, and I feel like it's pretty action-packed. But this just goes from action sequence to action sequence, and maybe I would get burnt out if this was what all kind of books were, but the fact that books don't do this, that there's so much like lead up to events and trying to like figure out what's gonna happen, and like calm periods after, you know, calm before the storm and calm after the storm in most books. This does not do it. It's a storm from start to finish, and I could not get enough of it. And I keep hearing again that this is one of the weaker books in the series. So cannot wait. So that's my 10. I'll look forward to going over and updating this list at the next quarter. We'll see how different it is. Hopefully it's wildly different. Hopefully I'm going to read a ton of books in the next 3 months that knock off all these. So we'll see. I doubt it for some of these, but we will see. Thank you so much. And as always, happy reading to you. Thank you so much to my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier patrons, Anna, Ben, Brian, CJ, Donute, Darren, Jamie, Maria, Michael Sugarman, My Book is Lit, Romeo Mike, Ron Reich, Russell, and Sky.